This chart tracks the Ethiopian birr against the US dollar. In July 2024, the line nosedives from 57 down to 106, a 63% loss. The government caused this drop deliberately, removing price controls to let the currency float freely. That sudden drop is actually the final release valve on a very old pressure cooker. It marks the climax of a 150-year-long political struggle over who actually controls the wealth of Ethiopia. Establishing a national currency is incredibly difficult. A government can print as many paper notes as it wants, but if the public refuses to trust the paper, the money is completely worthless. The history of the birr shows us that defining borders and fielding an army is rarely enough to make a fully functioning state. True national sovereignty requires absolute authority over what your citizens are willing to accept as money. In the 18th and 19th centuries, daily trade across Ethiopia relied on primitive money. People exchanged practical goods, like heavy bolts of cloth, solid iron bars, and even brass rifle cartridges. The most widely trusted domestic medium of exchange was salt. Miners in the Danakil Depression carved massive blocks of salt called Amole Tchew, which were transported by donkey and traded south to Lake Sway. For international trade, merchants relied on an Austrian coin, the Maria Theresa Thaler. The heavy silver coin became so highly trusted locally that it was dubbed the birr, which literally translates to silver in Ge'ez and Amharic. By the late 19th century, Emperor Menelik II wanted Ethiopia recognized as a modern global power. He knew that to achieve that, the nation needed to stop relying on Austrian silver and start minting its own sovereign currency. In 1894, Menelik issued a formal decree. He contracted the Paris Mint to produce tens of thousands of official Ethiopian silver and copper coins to replace the thaler. But a state cannot simply legislate trust. The Ethiopian public already had total faith in the intrinsic value of physical silver and salt, and they had very little reason to abandon them for unfamiliar coins carrying the emperor's face. Menelik's new currency was immediately rejected. Instead of trading the coins, citizens often melted them straight down to make silver jewelry. Paper money fared even worse. When the Bank of Abyssinia introduced paper banknotes in 1915, they were so deeply distrusted that government customs offices refused to accept them as payment, and rural merchants ignored them entirely. The situation grew more chaotic during the 1936 Italian occupation. Italian forces attempted to exert dominance by outlawing Ethiopian banknotes entirely, forcing citizens to exchange them for the Italian lira. The Ethiopian people responded by weaponizing their wealth. Rather than surrender their money to the occupying forces and adopt a lira, they actively hid and hoarded their old Ethiopian coins. Then, in 1941, British forces arrived to help drive out the Italians. They brought their own currency, the East African shilling, with them, throwing the local economy into a multi-currency free-for-all. Decades of overlapping decrees, of invading foreign currencies, and entirely rejected banknotes taught the public a very clear lesson. They learned to view state-mandated money with deep suspicion, treating the physical hoarding of wealth as a necessary survival mechanism. To fix this completely broken system, Emperor Haile Selassie staged a massive economic intervention in 1945. He reintroduced the national currency, creating what is now known as the Second Birr. This time, there was a strict mechanical shift in how the money worked. The government firmly pegged the value of the birr to the US dollar. By legally fixing the exchange rate, the state artificially mandated the currency's stability. This centralizing effort was cemented with the creation of the National Bank of Ethiopia. The new institution took over note production, marking the beginning of decades of rigid, top-down monetary control. The fixed peg finally gave the government the absolute sovereign control over its money that previous emperors had dreamed of. But it also entirely insulated the birr from the actual supply and demand realities of the global market. By 2020, the historical habit of keeping cash out of the system had grown into a massive crisis. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed found himself facing a modern, supersized version of the exact same hoarding problem from the 1930s. To force cash out of the black market and back into official banks, the government executed a massive demonetization strategy. They spent over $100 million printing entirely new banknote designs and declaring the old ones completely invalid. The recall exposed the sheer scale of the public's distrust. The government discovered that citizens had been hiding more than 113 billion birr entirely outside the official banking system. State control over the money supply had become so tight it was suffocating the wider economy. So in 2024, backed by billions in funding from the IMF and the World Bank, the government finally made the historic decision to let the birr float. The 63% plunge against the dollar we saw in July 2024 was simply the math catching up to reality. It was the painful release of a century and a half of artificial price fixing. For 150 years, Ethiopian rulers thought to force a national currency onto their people and dictate its exact worth. But they ultimately learned that true economic sovereignty doesn't come from forcing a peg. It comes from building an economy strong enough that your money can finally stand on its own.